Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canon. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
And today we're thrilled to be joined by Dr. John Mark Reynolds, the president of Saint Constantine School, as well as a faculty member at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Seminary and a fellow of the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. Previously, he served as the provost of Houston Christian University and the founder and director of the Torrey Honors College at Biola University. And appropriate for today's conversation, he has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Rochester, where he wrote his dissertation on analyzing cosmology and psychology in Plato's Timaeus. Dr. Reynolds, thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here because we get to talk about Plato. And it's hard to get better than talking about Plato with two awesome people. So this is fun. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us. We are very much looking forward to this. And listeners, you will know by clicking on the link that you did to open this episode that we're talking about Phaedo, one of the Platonic dialogues. And so we're very excited to jump into this. This is, I think, our second Platonic dialogue that we've discussed on the show. We did the Apology previously. I think it's been a couple of years since we've done that. And so this is sort of the sequel / prequel to that.
Yeah.
And so it depends on how you look at it. And I do have some interest. I think there's a lot of discussion about the framing of it, but perhaps we could just fill the listeners in with some context. What is going on in this dialogue, and what are some of the big questions that Plato wrestles with through the dialogue?
Well, like any Platonic dialogue, that is actually itself a very big question. Are we dealing with notions of immortality? Yes. Are we dealing with our relationship to our community, the city in which we live, including a teacher to his students? What's the duty of a teacher to his students? What's the relationship between body and matter? Is there a relationship between body and matter? How does eternity relate to where we're living now? And so these are all questions that come up. And it's also a sublime literary work. In that, as you move through it, there are parts of it that seem biographical. It's also one of the few dialogues where Plato mentions himself, but he mentions himself by being absent through being ill. Yet there are so many details in the dialogue that, though we know the discussion couldn't have just been transcribed, it is an imaginative work. We'd like to think that some of it, particularly towards the end, is true. And so lots of artworks that have been inspired by this piece, and a look at death that's really, before the coming of Christianity, I think profoundly religious and profoundly Christian.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's pretty crazy when you look at these, what are often considered early dialogues of Plato, where it's really, you see him coming to grips with the event of Socrates and how he's going to make sense of what's happened and how he's going to pick up the pieces and move forward from there. And this one among those that stretch of dialogues from maybe the Euthyphro through this has always really struck me as being just so very human. There's so many human touches to it, even from the description of the room and how Socrates is sitting and all these other various sorts of things that are going on.
This is the last of 5 dialogues that are often packaged together as like the life of Socrates or the death of Socrates, really. And that's a really good point, Doctor. It seems like this is true for Plato. He's a young man who's very successful. He comes from a wealthy family. He can do just about anything he wants to do. He wants to do his civic duty. But then comes this cataclysmic moment when the city he loves, Athens, murders the father of philosophy, Socrates. And how do you forgive the people for doing that? How do you forgive the city for doing that? How then should you live? Because unlike the disciples who have the Christ event, the Easter event, where they believe Christ to be risen, whatever you think of whether they believe that or not, notice that we don't get the claim that Socrates is really still alive and that we can talk to him through some kind of necromancy. So a very different sort of death, a death that's for Plato going to be final until he dies, and whatever occurs after death. And so I think even that difference between the death of Jesus and the reaction of the disciples, who seem to have had something different occur to them and so have a different reaction, Plato did not have something different happen to him. And so I think he lives a long time He lives a long life if history is to be believed.
Hmm.
Legends are to be believed. And I don't know that he ever comes to grips with the absent Socrates. So arguably the last thing he writes, the Laws, there is an Athenian stranger who takes the place of Socrates. He doesn't have a name throughout the longest thing Plato ever wrote, not quite finished probably before he died. But that stranger, that missing Socrates, is, I think, a big part of his psychology, his own personal psychology. And I don't want to create the error of reading a bit of sublime philosophy through a man's personal, pain. That's a mistake, as C.S. Lewis would point out to us if he were here. But it's just an interesting fact. It's an interesting fact about Plato. And I do think it's okay to say, when he's obviously writing about the death of Socrates here, and I don't think I said it as explicitly as I should have, when he's dealing with death in this dialogue, it's okay to say it profoundly affected him, to the point that he would mention himself as having missed the most important day in some ways. It's hard to believe that that would be literally true.
Yeah.
So describing himself as ill is, I think, a pretty beautiful image of the way he came to view himself as a young man.
Yeah. Yeah, I've often wondered about that. Was he really absent? If he was it because how sick would you have had to be to miss the death of Socrates? Or was it an instance of he was absent, but he couldn't face it? He couldn't stand to be there. If he was truly not there, how that must have affected him over the following years, that a sense of guilt, a sense of regret, a sense, all the things that come along with that. Some of us I wasn't present when my father died earlier this summer, and it's a shadow, I think, of what Plato would be feeling, but I can certainly understand there's a whole range of emotions that go through your head when this person who's very important to you dies and you're not there for that event.
Especially when he's been murdered by the city. I think it's pretty obvious that one thing that Socrates did was the city was counting on being able to do injustice, but not actually have to do it. It was a kind of public posturing. So here's a man with rich friends. You're holding him in a prison where really his rich friends could spring him at any time, try to get him to leave the city. So the city thinks in a very cavalier way, we can do injustice, we can take our shot at Socrates because his rich friends will cause him to escape. We'll get rid of Socrates. He'll go into exile. That will undermine his own teachings about virtue and wisdom. And an absent Socrates is not a martyred Socrates.
Yeah.
So I wonder if even Plato, who was rich and offered to pay fines for Socrates, isn't still trying to help his mentor escape, is the other thing I've thought, and came to see sickness of his own soul in not seeing what Socrates has to do. Being so virtuous on one level that you're out trying to help the master get away while the master is back dying for the city.
Well, and the fact that it's the Athenians' second attempt to get away with the injustice, right? Because they also offered him, he could have chosen exile as his punishment. That's what he was supposed to do back in the Apology. And he refused to assign himself what in his mind would be an injustice, a punishment. What do you think you deserve for what you've done? I think I should be treated with honor and feasted every day. That's what I deserve. Because he didn't play their game, he got saddled with a sentence that I think was harsher than his accusers were originally going for. But then, so this is the backup plan. Well, he'll still escape and we'll still get away with it. They fundamentally didn't understand what he was trying to teach them through that whole process.
Yeah, the Athenians are not the first to have an unjust social order that they can get away with having, because the harsh realities of what they're doing are hidden from the people for the most part. Socrates is so well known. He's, after all, a character that Aristophanes, either in good humor or helping getting him killed by parroting him in the clouds, he's a draw. Like, you can make a whole play making fun of Socrates and the worthlessness of his philosophy, and people will come and see it and enjoy it. And so in some ways, Socrates is using his fame to expose the evils of the city, which, after all, puts him on trial for corrupting the youth in a city where corrupting the youth was the basic educational system. If you wanted to be educated, you had to engage in this horrible education for trade, of the body, a thing he won't participate in.
Mhm.
He has to deal with crushed young men like Alcibiades, who come to him in the symposium, a different dialogue than we're reading today, so crushed in spirit that he can't do philosophy if he's been physically rejected. He can
Mhm.
only see philosophy as a kind of trade. And so to be rejected that way means he can't do philosophy. And Socrates is standing against that. I don't want to name the country, but I had a very good acquaintance who went to a country right after the fall of the Soviet Union, where he discovered that the women in the universities were used to professors hitting on them. I'll say it graciously. And when he refused to do that as a Christian, they actually grew angry with him because they thought he was either a racist or ethnocentric in some ways and didn't find them attractive. And that kind of corruption of the youth in an unjust system, which occurred under the Soviet Union in certain countries, is the same thing we see in Alcibiades and some of the youths that Socrates has to deal with. And these are his disciples that surround him. They are part of the city. And so Plato, with his sick soul, as a wealthy young man at that time, is living in a very unjust society. It is, after all, a society that operates with about half the population enslaved. Everything that goes on can go on because about half the population lives in slavery.
Yeah, so this is in a way what we're describing here is the reason why Socrates won't take his friends up on the offer of an escape. Because if he escapes, he at the very least loses the chance to expose this system, and at worst actually winds up supporting it and valorizing it.
I think he really would be supporting it, because he would be saying, well, it's not that serious. It's not that serious that just men can be punished ostensibly by being killed. It's not that bad. And we have a dialogue that deals with that at great length, but this dialogue makes a further claim, which is death isn't that bad.
Yeah.
Given that the soul is immortal and that we will escape to a better world, for Plato maybe then to come back in a kind of reincarnation system, if we take other dialogues as being compatible with this one. Death isn't that bad. So we don't have to do injustice because we will escape. It's a little bit like the difference between Hobbes and Locke when it comes to revolution. If revolution is so bad that anything is preferable to the chaos of revolution, then someone like Hobbes is right. Don't ever revolt against the Leviathan state. Locke says, yeah, revolution is very, very, very bad, but the alternative is not so bad, revolution, that you can't sometimes consider it if you're careful. And Socrates is going to make a similar kind of argument. I'm being anachronistic, working backwards, but he's making a similar kind of argument when it comes to his individual soul. We don't want to die. We don't want to die before our time. We don't kill ourselves. We don't commit suicide because we can't be perfectly sure of what occurs after death. And because there's a certain piety towards the gods in living out the life that we're called to live. And life is sweet in many ways. But there are certain injustices, certain things we could do to our souls that continued life just isn't worth it. And so Socrates is willing to make those arguments. And he makes them in light of his students saying, well, come on, man. How do you know the soul is immortal? You're taking a big chance. If your soul isn't immortal, and you're just dead, then you're dead. And maybe it's worth escaping because we need you around. We feel like tomorrow without Socrates is going to be really bad for us. And he agrees. Tomorrow without Socrates, it'll be pretty bad for you. You better hope that someone like I am comes along.
Can I have a quick question kind of related to this.
Sure.
He at the beginning of the dialogue, when they're getting into this topic of death and death that really isn't so bad, and he even frames the whole task of philosophy around preparing for death, studying death, to practice death. I felt sort of caught between two extremes, right? Because part of that preparation for death is the getting rid of attachment, and so on the one hand, there were things in that section that reminded me of sayings of Jesus, To be a philosopher is to follow one who dies, is what Socrates says, which is like, yeah, that's also what the New Testament says. It reminded me of the Desert Fathers. It reminded me of Cassian. But I also think about certain passages in Scripture about the significance of God-given attachments, what God hath put together, let no man put asunder, the household code of Ephesians 5. And so obviously these attachments are precious. And so, you know, we have that. We have Jesus saying, don't call any man father, you know, so those relationships are a means of grace when they're treated in their proper context, but not as a sort of ultimate thing. So I guess, how do we balance that call to death, but also honoring the sort of vocations and contexts in which we're enmeshed?
Yeah.
This is very good, because I think this dialogue, this is my own view, this dialogue was misunderstood often by the Neoplatonists themselves, by followers of Plato. What prominence do you give? It's kind of denigration of the body. So you go through it, Socrates will compare his own body to a tomb, essentially. And look, I'm escaping from the tomb of my body, to a place where I can see more clearly, because my body is full of erotic impulses that keep me from wisdom, from philosophy. This is very contrary, I think, to the New Testament properly understood.
Yeah.
But just as Paul is sometimes misunderstood when he talks about the body, so I think Plato here is misunderstood. This is one dialogue in the entire Platonic canon, and it's a dialogue of a master trying to comfort his disciples about his impending death, and why death isn't so terrible. It's very terrible. And his assumption is that we will think it's terrible, that we should escape it at any cost. And so he uses some hyperbole, I think, in saying, I can escape my body. It's okay. My body, after all, is a mixed bag at my age. Getting away from it is okay, because of this better life that's to come. Now, I think that sometimes Plato's own distant descendants looked at the dialogues, and this became the master key to understand how we should look at these attachments, Father. We should put them down. We become otherworldly in the strongest sense, and that's a real tradition inside of Platonism. I don't think it's the only tradition to come out of Plato, and it's not what I think Plato meant to say. And I would point to Timaeus, his next to the last dialogue, in which the human soul is essentially always embodied. It's either embodied in a star, which is the most desirable kind of body to have, or heck, it's embodied in a fish, a thing you don't want to be embodied in, like one of the worst things to be embodied in. So I don't accept, of course, this notion of transmigration of souls, but it does indicate that escaping the body is a kind of metaphor in Phaedo for Plato, and that we can overdo his view of putting down the body. I think this also gets at Plato's sometimes putting down physical pleasures. If you look at what we know about Plato's life, if we take, letter 7? That's the biographical letter. I sometimes think we like letter 7 as authentic, only because we otherwise would know nothing about Plato's life. Like, that's the main argument. We want to believe that this is true. So but as Plato looks at physical pleasures, he's a man of the world. He's a wealthy guy. He likes hanging around with his friends. He likes eating and drinking. You know, his name indicates strength and wealth. And so he assumes that most of the people around him's major problem all the time is they want physical pleasures, and that physical pleasures are impeding them from seeing the good. You know, that I'm going to go home and watch too much television and eat too many chips and think about the Packers instead of thinking about serious things. That is often a temptation for me. And so he assumes that's true. As he's been read over centuries and centuries and centuries, there's a personality type to whom that's really toxic advice. Where, what for me, the hyperbole, take Jesus. Jesus says, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Now, a teacher ought to be able to use metaphors like that, and it be understood to be a metaphor. But a kind of fundamentalism, eventually, if you have enough students over a long enough period of time, somebody is going to be the kind of person that says, that means I should pluck out my eyes. And this has actually occurred. In this, I think Plato develops a long tradition of people who become otherworldly, They denigrate physical reality in a strong way. They won't get involved in science, which is the opposite of what Plato would have advised them to do. And they also begin to put down their own bodies to develop a weird sort of ascetic lifestyle. And I think it's because Plato he was talking to normal people. He was talking to people that have a kind of virtue, right? They don't care about things of this world. But if you have that virtue can become a vice, and Plato becomes very bad. This dialogue in particular can become very bad for the soul of that kind of person. A little bit like in Romans, when Paul talks about the flesh, right? Our bad natures, our sinful natures, and he locates it in a kind of flesh metaphor. If you're inclined to hate the body, if you're inclined to self-destructive tendencies, you almost wish those kind of people wouldn't read Paul, because they're capable of reading him correctly. For what I take to be correctly. Same thing here in Plato, in my opinion.
If I could deepen that too textually, because a couple of points. I mean, the first one is the Greek phrase is melite thanatou, which is readiness for death, and I think a lot of folks they feel that as desiring. It's not about desiring death. It's not about seeking death. It's about this preparation, right? If I can borrow from Shakespeare, the readiness is all. That's what Hamlet's trying to express in Act 5, and so it's when you have this fundamental disposition, a habitus, if you will, that is open to death, it's therefore able to welcome death, but it's not death seeking, then that does relativize your other desires without at the same time denying them. And so in the end of the Apology, he says to the Athenians, look, if you want to, this is what I'll ask of you, right? Treat my sons the way I treated your sons. Hold them accountable the way I held you accountable. He has the attachment to his sons, and he's concerned about their welfare, and he's giving this out. I think also even the question, the sort of side view of his wife that we get here, that it's not that he doesn't care about her, has no feeling for her, but his understanding of what is reasonable and spiritual, because there's the daimon that's involved in this whole process as well, that hasn't warned him, shut up, Socrates, you're going to get yourself killed, right? He's trying to show us ordered loves. He does love his wife. He does love his kids, but that's not more important than his love for his soul and then his witness to the truth.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also the unseemliness of her mourning. He's very harsh with her. I think that's true. But it also is the case that it's very human in that he's trying to help the community around him survive his death. And a kind of screaming mourning, maybe that's good for tomorrow, but he has very little time to talk to people who can hear what he has to say. He has hours. And so we'll scream tomorrow. We'll be really sad tomorrow. There's plenty of time for Socrates to be dead and to mourn his death. There isn't plenty of time to talk to Socrates. It's a little bit as if somebody had come to the Last Supper with foreknowledge and decided to spend a lot of time bemoaning the Romans and, shaking their fist at the unjust system at the Sanhedrin. No, let's get the teachings of Jesus that we find in John.
So, not to push back, but I want to go a little further into this point, because I think that's a great way of kind of getting out of the tension between those two poles. Though I will say, if you want to prepare for death, you should just become a Cowboys fan. It's a great way. Leave the Packers behind.
Go Pack, go. I had to live through. None of you here had to live through the 70s and 80s Packers when I was a kid. And
I was busy enjoying the 80s 49ers. What's up?
Yeah, that's it. So I had my pain. Pain. This is a better realm.
Well, your pleasure has only sprung out of the opposite then, I guess. Look,
the good news is both of you know who the starting quarterback for the New York Jets will be in 15 years. It will be Jordan Love. And,
that's right. It's a pipeline.
Yeah, it's good news.
So I hear what you all are saying, and I think it's a helpful way of understanding the dialogue, that this isn't purely anti-Semitic like it is often interpreted. However, I am curious about the section then where he does talk about learning, because when we get to that section, it's not just that the erotic impulses of the body distract from learning. It's the very sort of nature of the body, that it has senses at all, is kind of what distracts us from learning. And so he seems to favor a sort of pure deduction, because of course the soul is immaterial and therefore divine, and the body is mutable and changeable. And so I know, just to preface this, I spent the day in Summa Contra Gentiles, where Aquinas is sort of arguing against some, and to be fair, he's arguing against Neoplatonism, but he's making this argument that's a really bad way of thinking about learning. So I'm curious, how does that kind of how should we understand that? Yeah,
I think ultimately Plato is going to think, I think quite correctly, that science is going to end up being about math and mathematical modeling a lot more than it's going to be about experience. And so modern physics, I would argue, has caught up with him in this regard, physics being kind of the master science at this point. But leaving aside my shots at Aristotle, which are unfair and not just at all, because you should make those. I would say something like this. Again, I think if you only look at this dialogue, this is probably too extreme. This rhetoric is too extreme. It should be rolled back. If you look at other dialogues and the value of looking at the world as part of the process of reaching the divine, you have to have the steps up Diotima's ladder, for example, in Symposium. And so all of this has its value, but the highest good can only be obtained in the beatific vision, right? When we see God, or the good, if he's not a theist, face to face. So I think you're right. If you want to follow the line that some Neoplatonists took, which is the body is just bad, it's evil and corrupted, this is where you would rest your case. That is absolutely true. I would say the other dialogues suggest that we're getting very language of hyperbole here. And Socrates himself has spent his life dealing with real students in the real city, usually in the marketplace, in a loud, noisy place, living in the world. And he's ready for the next step. He's ready for his soul to see God unshadowed, as close to seeing God as a human soul can do. And so he's excited about it. And he's excited to leave pleasures, lower pleasures behind. That's how I would read it. But look, if someone wants to take the view that Plato thought the body was bad, and many of his later disciples wanted to take that view, and many of his critics want him to have that view, then this is, I agree, one of the passages where you would rest that case. And I can only sort of soften it. I can't pretend it's not there. It is really there.
I wasn't going to go this direction, but now you've forced my hand. We do have the impossible. It's not a task we can complete, but it is something that we also can't help speculating about, which is where to draw the line between what Socrates thinks and what Plato thinks. And one of the things that I wonder, I really wonder how you would respond to this, John Mark, from the standpoint of looking at the entire corpus. Here's a thesis. I won't say that it's my view. I'll just throw something out and see what your take is. Socrates has a fairly healthy and balanced view of the role of the body in human life and existence, and Plato starts off with a much harsher take on that for whatever reason. And then, and so Socrates and Plato are a bit at odds here, and Plato's being challenged by what he's hearing Socrates say. But then what we see over the course of the corpus is Plato sort of wrestling with that and maybe moving more in Socrates' direction the more he fiddles with it. How does that strike?
Yeah, I think that that's perfectly possible. I am personally, I will give my view, and I'm in print saying it, so I'm stuck. I change my mind. That would be okay too. I think Socrates does not always represent Plato in the dialogues. In fact, I think he often is wrong inside dialogues. And of course, as I already pointed out, he doesn't even appear in the last dialogue. And in many dialogues, see the Timaeus, he's not carrying the argument. So in the Timaeus, do you have to say Socrates is Plato, but he's not saying anything? And Timaeus, who's commended as the greatest thinker on this topic, doesn't represent Plato. I don't think Plato is represented by any of the characters in his dialogue. I think he's always the master writing up above, and that the Platonic Socrates, the Socrates we see in Plato, who's so different than the other Socrates we get in literature, is in many ways a person without a lot of doctrines. He's a person who is examining the doctrines of others and finding them wanting. So
Mhm.
that way he's just sort of a skeptic. But then second, I don't think he is, this is so anachronistic, postmodern in the sense that you can't find the truth. I think he thinks the truth is knowable. And I would actually argue something like the theory of recollection is lurking around in the back of Socrates' teaching, that you
Mhm.
can find the truth, that we know the truth, that there's a common humanity where we can all get it if we work.
Mhm.
But I think most of the doctrines that we would associate with Plato, and I do believe Plato held doctrines, contra some of my own teachers that I owe a lifetime worth of gratitude to. I do think he has doctrines, and I think they come later. So
Mhm.
yeah, I do think there is a development, and the development is partially wrestling with Socrates. Like,
Mhm.
what do I make of what Socrates left me? What do I make of this kind of Socratic method of beginning with asking a hard question, challenging standard answers to it, coming to a point of bewilderment? What comes next?
Yeah.
What comes next after everybody's confused and we're still, tomorrow comes.
Yeah.
And so what do we do next? And I think that's where Plato tries to pick up and complete Socrates' work. And this is the value of Aristotle, right?
Mhm.
Aristotle is a world-class intellect who picks up Plato's challenge. And I will say this, I think with no fear of contradiction here, that Plato's own ethics are completed by Aristotle. The notion of akrasia, weakness of the will, is a great improvement, in my opinion, on what Plato left us. And so most Platonists just talk about it, even though it's not found in Plato's own work. Hints of it are found in
Mhm.
Plato's own work because it's the standard objection to Plato's ethics. It's the
Mhm.
first thing any student, any freshman will think of. And Aristotle is saying, well, look, this is okay. And I think that Aristotle, I'm with A.E. Taylor in that I don't think Plato and Aristotle are in opposition. I think often Aristotle is kind of completing Plato's work.
Would you go as far as Boethius to say that they were in union about everything?
I would like to say that, but I don't think I can show it. So
Yeah, right.
it's what I wish to be true, but
Yeah.
I think it isn't true. I think the famous School of Athens painting, which
Mm,
can't have conversations like this without somebody putting on a cover somewhere,
that's right.
is very powerful in that we often look at, one's pointing down, the other's pointing up, Plato, and we look at the difference, but they're standing right next to each other
Mhm.
at the very center of that painting. And I think that's how the medievals, of course, the Renaissance thinkers thought of them.
Mhm.
And I think that's how I think of them.
Mhm.
Plato didn't have the benefit of discovering logic like Aristotle did. So we have to again say Aristotle's arguments are going to be better in one way, from my point of view, because he has the tool of logic to use overtly, whereas Plato only has the tool of logic in a kind of crude, I'm going to make a good persuasive case. I'm going to
Yeah.
use rhetoric correctly as opposed to incorrectly. So Aristotle and Plato as kind of completions of each other. It's important. But when you're reading this dialogue, Phaedo, that we're talking about today, I think the important thing for people to see is these are real characters in a dialogue. So you can become very frustrated with Socrates' arguments for the immortality of the soul because you might yell, that's not persuasive to me. Why doesn't this interlocutor say this instead of that? Well, because the characters are the characters we have. And
Mhm.
Plato is inviting us to dialogue about these arguments ourselves, to yell at Socrates, to try to tease out what Socrates might have said, and to remember that I don't think Plato is trying to make a knockdown, drag out argument for the immortality of the soul the way we would today in analytic philosophy, for example. He's trying to persuade a generation of disciples in literary form that it's okay that Socrates is dead, that there's hopefulness, and inviting those same disciples into a continuing discussion, not into a kind of static. When I first read this, I was a kid. I bumped into this Platonic dialogue, and I thought the thing to do was a little bit like memorizing Sherlock Holmes stories.
Mm.
You could do cool Sherlock Holmes tricks.
Mhm.
You're never going to meet a weaver with a thumb in the world, it turns out. In the same way, just memorizing these arguments for the immortality of the soul probably won't be persuasive to any modern person you run into. You'd have to iterate. These were persuasive to the people that Plato imagines were present to his community.
So this is one of the things I wanted to hear you talk about today. Not in any way disagreeing. It's a little bit at odds with what you just said, but not because I disagree. I want to hear you evaluate the fourth argument for the immortality of the soul, which is the argument that the soul means life, and life can't die, so you're done. I mean, that's a really crude version of it, but that's how it can sound, especially to modern ears. And it sounds like a language game and like it's a trick. And this is the thing that I find students are most like, whoa, hold a second, follow the play, like what's going on here? Because it just seems like Plato is substituting a definition for an account or something along those lines.
I'm actually pretty sympathetic. It's a weird sympathy, I guess. I'm pretty sympathetic to this kind of argument because when we look at the world, it's the Socratic fallacy, of course, to think we have to define a thing to be able to know what it is. So I can't define. I could reach over if we were with each other right now and not virtually, and get whatever you just drank out of and hand it to you. When you said, "Get me my drink," I don't even know what's inside that. I hope not vodka at this time of day. Probably water. You seem like a healthy kind of guy, but I don't know. But I could still get it for you and hand it to you and cause you to drink. Get me my container. Get me my drink. There are lots of things I don't know about it. If I were a little kid, I have my first grandchildren recently, and so the oldest is 2, and she's a delight to talk to because she can say many things that are far beyond what she knows or can find. So she sounds very precocious sometimes because she's sort of repeating adult words. She said to the dog Cosmo, "I'm not going to give you the cold shoulder." I'm pretty sure that's just repeating a phrase that she heard one of us use, and kind of contextually it made sense. But it sounds really intelligent in ways that, much as I love my granddaughter, I doubt are directly attributable to her comprehension. Now, I said all of that to say something like this. We've looked at the world, Plato could say, and we looked at the parts of human beings. And we looked at one part of human beings and said, oh, that's the life thing. And we looked at another part of human beings and said, that's the stuff thing. And why should we doubt that? Why should we doubt this initial judgment? I don't know what's inside that container that you just drank out of, but it looks like a container full of drink. I suppose you could be faking me out and there was air in there. You're not drinking anything. You want the illusion of drinking something because, I don't know, it's collegial. Look, he's doing it too.
You're making us thirsty, man. Come on.
Everyone's faking us out. But why would I believe any of that?
Right.
I think it's a decent argument to say, you appear, good professor, to be drinking something. I bet you're drinking a liquid. At this time of day, it's probably water. And I make that hypothesis just because of the way we name things and what I know about you. So given what we know about Greek people and given what they've seen about the human body, I think it's kind of cool to say, you know, the thing we call life, that's a living thing. So I don't think it can die. I'm going to bet that it can't die. That's a decent intuition. It's almost so pure, right? It's almost so pure. We look at something big and we say, that's big. And someone says, can you name something that's big? And we name it. That big thing over there is big. But you wouldn't then say to me, but now you're just using the label.
Yeah.
That living thing is alive. Okay. And then, you know, you have the corollary, like sub-argument that would say, how does death come into life? How can death penetrate life? So we've got a thing that we define by being alive. How can death penetrate that? So, you know, I don't.
Doesn't he have to, in order to get that version of the argument, though? Doesn't he have to assume? And I suppose that what was it? The second argument was trying to not assume this, but give an account for it. But a prior commitment would have to be that life is more powerful than death.
Yeah, death is a kind of negation of life.
Yeah, that's right.
And how can the negation enter into the thing itself? Sort of following Parmenides is cannot not be.
Uh-huh.
And so if you accept that, this living thing can't die. Yet
Mhm.
we appear to die. And so that means we're a complex structure. There's the part of us that we've always called alive. And then there's the part of us that we see changing all the time. I cut my fingernails, I don't feel like a different person. So
Mhm.
there's the stuff part of me that we say, yeah, that doesn't seem to be alive in the same way that my soul seems to be alive. And
Mhm.
for students who are cynical about that, I mean, let's take a very simple, like, parallel example. You cannot build a blue castle no matter how many red Legos you have.
Mhm.
So you have piles of red Legos, and can you build a castle? Sure, you can, but you can't build a blue castle out of all those red Legos, assuming the light stays the same. Uh,
Mhm.
so in the same way, you can't get death out of a life.
Mhm.
Negate, where does it come from? Where does death come from? And in the same way, if the life part departs from wherever it is located, your body, then your body can't be alive because life has departed.
Mhm.
The life part is gone. So if you've got a pile of red Legos and somehow the color changed, you extract the color from it with some color extraction instrument, and you put a new color in. When the red color departs, you don't have redness anymore.
Yeah.
So it's redness that makes the Lego red, not being a Lego.
Mhm. Mhm.
Now, is this persuasive? Not to a certain kind of person, but again, this is like when we talk about miracles. I've experienced certain kinds of miracles of healing in my life. I'm
Mhm.
a little boy, I'm very sick. The doctor doesn't know why. My dad prays for me. I instantly feel better and never feel sick in that way again.
Mhm.
Well, that's not going to convince anybody inclined not to believe in miracles. And
Right.
so I never used it that way. On the other hand, since I'm not inclined to believe in miracles, that's a pretty good story. And it works for me because I experienced it. In the
Mhm.
same way, if you're a person who's kind of rooting for life after death, and you
Mhm.
look at the world and you look at unhindered, almost 2-year-old experiences of the world and the way they label the world. Hey, look, that's a living thing. Hey,
Mm.
look, ideas don't seem like stuff.
Mhm.
We get a pile of stuff, it doesn't seem like an idea. Even bigger pile of stuff, it doesn't seem like an idea. In the same way, mind, like the part of you I care about.
Mm.
If you were put in a robot and your mind were there, I think I would be satisfied.
Mm.
I would think that was you.
Mm.
And in the same way, then Plato would say the mind seems to be more like an idea, an eternal thing, a thing not made out of stuff, than it seems like a thing made out of stuff.
Mm.
Now, that's either persuasive to you or not. It's not ever going to persuade a materialist at all.
Yeah. But what's great about that is we have to have a separate episode about the robot thing. But what's great about that is I
Sure.
think what we what we need for our
About this.
what we need for our students is not the that they be persuaded by the argument, but that they see how it was a reasonable argument to place, right?
Yeah,
And I think that's what you're giving us is this is an account that is exactly the type of account that his disciples in the room would be looking for in that moment, and that renders it understandable.
Yeah, here's what we think. If I say to Whim Wham, even at 2, who is a reasonable functioning human, go get the professor a drink, and she brings you a cup or the only object in the room that looks like it contains a drink, I bet it contains a drink.
Yeah.
Like, that's my bet.
Yeah.
In fact, I'm pretty sure it will contain a drink, and she's 2. So I think we correctly label the world most of the time. No, the world isn't flat, though it seems to be superficially. It isn't, if you look at it very closely, even with our crude eyes, it doesn't seem flat, but it does seem flat, sort of. So we can make mistakes about this kind of thing. But we don't start there. We don't start with the assumption that the appearances of the world are false. In fact, to the contrary, I often call this an epistemology of belief inside of Plato. Plato thinks that we live in a shadow world. The world's always changing and becoming, but he also thinks our experiences are more or less right as far as it goes, and we can hold on them. We don't want to live on them because they are always changing, but we can build on them. We can get somewhere with them because the cosmos isn't perverse. Now, the one thing I will say, Father, that you were pointing towards is because the world's always changing, we want to get to the higher world of mathematics that isn't changing, higher world of ideas, and not just get stuck on the world of appearances. But on the other hand, the world of appearances is not so perverse that we can't make progress. Here's how it is not good, not in a moral sense, but in a reasonable sense. Like, for Plato, is always attracted to like. Like is always attracted to like, even if ethically, for example, it shouldn't be. So the very earthy rock that falls off the building will hit the ground where there is more substance. So like is attracted to like, even if one of the three of us is standing in the way and we happen to die. That's bad. That's irrational. That shouldn't take place. But it's not bad in a moral sense for Plato. It's the way it goes. If you're going to have a physical world driven by physical laws, it's not always going to be reasonable what occurs. It's reasonable in that it's following, it's law-like, but it isn't the way it should be all the time. And mind can make the world the way it should be all the time. This is a tension for Plato, and a tension in this dialogue. Remember, he's erring in this dialogue on putting down the physical reality and putting up the immaterial reality to comfort the students and have them be okay. And also, it's just true, we're all going to die.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing that we all know sitting here is that 50 years from now, maybe 60, 70 years from now, for some of you younglings, we're not going to be here.
Yeah.
And somebody, if this is preserved somehow, God help them, and they're looking at it, we won't be here to have conversations about it, but we were here. And so the question is then, where did we go? Did we go nowhere? Did we go somewhere? And where is this somewhere where we went?
Yeah. I think that's part of why I chose this dialogue for this season, is because a big part of its importance in the history of Western thought is, whatever you think of the arguments, I think it's pretty safe to say that from this dialogue on, this is the assumption, is that there is an immortal soul. It was not invented here. The idea was around before that, and that sort of a thing. It has a prehistory, but this is one of those watershed moments where people are going to hearken back to this and say, well, Plato has demonstrated that the soul is immortal, and so it sets all of Western thinking down a certain pathway that is obviously very important for later developments like Christianity, but it continues to resonate today. And I mean, I think you still find even debates about consciousness as an emergent property among physicalists are beholden to the tradition that, the trajectory that Plato sets us on with this dialogue. And so it is really a remarkable thing.
Yeah, look, Plato, if you take a really strong view of Platonism, doesn't have the hard problem of consciousness. Why are we aware? Why am I able to think? And often in debating people on this topic, whether on the internet or somewhere else, I'm always reminded that people will say, well, Reynolds, you've never seen a human mind without a brain. And I always make the very simple point that they have never seen a brain without having a human mind.
Yeah.
No one has ever seen a brain, so-called, without having a mind. So you can't just keep going in circles. You're going to have to prefer one as first to the other, or you could have them both simultaneously, I suppose. But you can't just say brain comes first because, look, there is one. This person who's thinking has a human brain. It's like when people say to me in debates, and it has to do with this dialogue directly, prayer or your experience of God is just in your head. Which my response is always, what experience are you having that's not just in your head? What is it? And why do you prefer one to the other? All our experiences are first in our heads. We're aware of it. and we prioritize some over the other, and that's important and good. But I don't see why like religious experiences are somehow more in my head than any other experience. That's just a bizarre falsehood.
That's right. That's to me one of the beauties of philosophy done well, and you see this in Plato, and he represents it across a variety of characters, including pre-Socratic characters who show up in the dialogues. You see it very well in Aristotle. The ability to point to something very straightforward once you've named it. Like, of course, our head is where experience happens. That's part of what it means that it's an experience, right? Experience is subjective. And yet sometimes it takes a philosopher to say it so that we remember that, oh, right, there's actually nothing strange here. They're making a big deal out of nothing.
Yeah, it's sometimes people think of idealism, for example, as very, very strange. That everything is fundamentally, let's say, theistic idealism, an idea in the mind of God, and that it's the mind of God. Everything else is kind of a sim inside the mind of God. It seems weird, except when you realize it would make absolutely no difference to us. We could do science. It's a regular universe. It means miracles are no longer odd. They could happen. They wouldn't happen very frequently. None of it would matter. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because you would cease to have, what is consciousness? Well, that's what's fundamental. What is matter? Matter is an illusion created by the mind of God, but it's not an illusion in the sense of a bullet won't kill you. Because inside the sim, those are the rules. Bullets will kill you. Contra Samuel Johnson, if you kick a rock, it will hurt you, even if idealism is true. The trouble of materialism, it seems to me, is that I see no possibility of solving the hard problem of consciousness. Like, how do ideas just arise or come from matter? It just doesn't seem to be that kind of thing at all. Dualism, of course, how the two things interact, unless you take it as a base given, that's a problem. Do they just sit in parallel forever? And so I think that Platonism is always going to have a certain appeal, like very strong Platonic idealism, because it's a very simple, intuitive way of looking at the world once you realize what the options are. Materialism, I think, to people seems intuitive because we can reach out and touch a desk, and saying that the desk is just an idea in the mind of God seems overly complicated until you realize, okay, what was your experience of touching the desk? Where does it occur? What is a desk? And then this becomes who are you? And nobody thinks they're their body, because their body has constantly been changing over the course of their lives.
I've been reading All Things Are Full of Gods by David Billy Hart. And this is the big thing that the whole, which is also a stress set up like a Socratic dialogue. And this is exactly what he talks about in his chapter on qualitative consciousness, that he says it's not a question of how mental experience seems. The mind can't merely seem to be what mind seems to be, because the very reality of seeming as such is the reality of mental experience, which is what the mechanistic philosophy can't accommodate. And so he emphasizes the first person sort of experience, because he says what's significant about any of our mental processes is that there's an I to whom the thing appears. There's always that I.
Back when I did sort of internet debates, I quit doing them because they went nowhere.
Twitter was sane when you were on it, I will say.
What?
Twitter was sane when you were on it.
I appreciate that.
I missed your presence. I'm not on it anymore either, but you were one of my favorite follows.
I stopped right before this, the presidential election, when we're doing it, has already occurred in 2024. And way back at the beginning of 2024, I said, things are going to go crazy. Doesn't matter who wins, doesn't matter who's for anyone. Everyone's going to be expected to have an opinion about everything. Not having an opinion about everything will be viewed as having an opinion about everything. I'm out before I possibly my non-opinion could be attributed as an opinion about evil. So that was kind of the decision-making process. But to get back to this, in talking to people, they'll try to pick something like, well, it's not stuff, it's not matter that we get mind from. physics now shows us at the very bottom it's wave functions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not helpful at all if you think
No.
about it, because my experience of redness doesn't seem like a wave function. My listening to Bach doesn't, it might be made of wave functions, my physical response to it and the people playing things, but that's a little bit like saying, what is Hamlet that can be stored, I'll date myself, on a DVD, a Blu-ray, streamed over bits through the net, and is on paper in my office and ink. What's the play's the thing, it seems like, that they all have in common, and it's the play that captures the conscience of the king, not paper and ink chemistry or wave functions inside of the actors or inside of the person.
That's right.
It just doesn't seem like it's like the person who thinks love is sex.
Yeah.
Feel like they've never been in love.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing wrong with either thing inherently, but they're not the same thing.
It just recommits the same category error, pointing to a different aspect of physicality to explain how physicality can be the source of seemingly non-physical phenomena doesn't actually address the question.
Yeah, and this is, Plato makes a lot out of this in Phaedo, lest people think we've gone far away. It seems like the soul is more like the harmony of notes that a harp might play than the strings itself. Yeah. Like, so we're thinking about his notion of harmony is different than ours, but it's okay. We can think about harmony in our way. So you have harmony of notes. I can think about it in my mind less well than my wife can, who's a classically trained musician, but we can both think about it. And that harmony isn't destroyed by the fact that, for example, her trumpet was recently stolen, that she's had all her life. And that's very sad. Like, it's deeply sad. I did everything I could to try to find it and get it back. But we got another trumpet for her, and the sweet music that's inside of her still comes forth on the new trumpet. So the destruction of the old Bach Stradivarius didn't destroy the music. Yeah. And Plato makes a big deal out of that. He thinks it really counts, that the three of us can't be destroyed in some fundamental way because we're an idea and we're going to go on. And then I think for a Christian theist, we can go on in the mind of God. Like, where do we go after death? We are, in a sense, stored in the mind of God. And if you're an idealist, I happen not to be. I sound like I'm an idealist today.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, the dualist. But even on the weakest sense, you're just stored in the mind of God. You experience reality. And this is something I think people can relate to. This idea of ideas being eternal and not going away. That if there were no humans, 2 + 2 still would be 4. Yeah.
No, I think it's very true. And this is, one of the things that I would encourage people to think about, along with all the things John Mark is saying about this dialogue, is, don't lose the thread of what Socrates is saying for the details of them, right? Which is what happens if you take each of the arguments for the immortality of the soul individually and assess them individually and try to determine how good an argument is this and whatever else. But it's a tapestry that he's weaving, and you have to take it all together and say, what's the thing, the reality that all four of these are witnessing to and pointing at, such that even if one of the arguments or all of the arguments fail in some way, they fail meaningfully in the same direction and still cause something to appear even in their failure.
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. I think that's exactly right. You're pointing to these dialogues are not just, sometimes in philosophy, we'll look at one of these dialogues and Gregory Vlastos was bad about doing this. We'll just pull an argument out of them and we don't even care anymore. We'll do versions of the argument. Oh, this argument fails for this reason, and we'll keep fixing it. And that's he's a great philosopher, or was a great philosopher. So that's fine to do. But that's not what Plato was doing. Plato was embedding these arguments in a literary background with characters inside of a dialogue he's writing. And it's supposed to be persuasive to those characters in community. If they're not persuasive to us, then he's inviting us into the dialogue, and then we can do what Vlastos did. We can improve the arguments, so-called. We can make them more persuasive to us, and that very exercise brings us closer to immortality because we're engaged in mindful activity.
Could I ask a quick question? Because I have a lot I'd like us to talk about more, but I think it's probably wise that we begin to descend to the end of the argument or the conversation. But I think why would Plato write this the way that he does? So it's not that he puts us in the room as Socrates is dying, but he puts us in the words of someone who was in the room when Socrates was dying. What is with the framing tool here?
Yeah. So the difference is he's not there. He separates himself from it, from the passions of it himself. And he is he's inviting us to join in. He's inviting us to become part of the dialogue. I've never met anyone who reads this, Phaedo in particular, who doesn't start arguing with Socrates and his interlocutors. Like, I wish you would say this and not that. Why do they agree with him so quickly about the other thing? There's something about the way this is written that invites argument. But then inside of the prelude and the postlude, where he actually dies, we're drawn into a purely literary construct where we experience the death of Socrates. I mean, this is such a moving ending that it's inspired paintings and sculptors and will until the end of time. This is the very image of philosophy that Plato powerfully draws. And so he's doing, if there are three parts to the human soul, he's rationally engaging you. There's something ennobling, spirited about what goes on, particularly at the end, when Socrates plants his feet firmly on the floor, that wonderful detail, or where he looks out into eternity with his eyes fixed open inside of death. I was recently reading some really dreadful internet article on the death of Socrates. And they were pointing out that if you actually drink hemlock, you die in giant convulsions. It's a horrible way to die. And they were saying, oh, but Plato cleans it up and makes it pretty. No, even if we assume that this article is correct and that everyone must die that way, that drinks hemlock, that's a very powerful statement by Plato about the truth of what was going on in the master. The master dies this way indeed, even if he didn't appear to die that way, because that's who Socrates was. And so we're invited into not history so much as in history as it should have been.
There's a cool moment too in the framing where as the situation's being described, I think this is around 88 D, one of the listeners who's hearing the story of what happened says, "By the gods, Phaedo, you have my sympathy, for as I listen to you now, I find myself saying to myself, what argument shall we trust now that of Socrates, which was extremely convincing, has fallen into discredit? The statement that the soul is some kind of harmony has a remarkable hold on me now and always, and it was when it was mentioned, it reminded me that I had myself previously thought so." So in other words, the listener is having his moment of recollection as this story is being told to him, which I think it's a cool way of allowing that theory of knowledge to be demonstrated a step further, I think.
Yeah, there are a few of these dialogues. Symposium is another one where the dialogue itself is embedded inside another dialogue, inside sometimes another dialogue. And of course, Plato's writing the whole thing and we're reading it. And this embedding, I think, often takes place when the subject's going to be very dangerous or difficult. So here we're going to be dealing with death and immortality. And there's a sense where he makes you work to get to the dialogue. Like you have to work through this convoluted setup. You have to do that in Symposium as well. And maybe the bad reader will lose interest and go away. Soul is harmed. Or we'll come to see that these are very deep things. That these are things that we don't come to lightly. That experiencing them, Father, directly might be a little unholy. Yeah. And we're just sitting here shooting the breeze about something that's very difficult, life, death, and we think it's kind of funny. But now and at the hour of our death, we will not find it as amusing, I suspect.
Mhm. So in other words, it's a sort of Platonic way of obeying the not yet given command not to throw pearls before swine.
Yeah, and to kind of distance yourself from the topic itself because it's so dangerous. It might overwhelm us.
Mm.
It's still pretty overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Get to it. But sure, you don't want to make it, it's the opposite of clickbait.
Yeah.
This beginning, and Plato knows how to write clickbait. He can begin a dialogue. I went down with Glaucon. It's very first person in the Republic. We're immediately engaged in the dialogue and off we go.
Mm-hmm.
And the prelude to Republic is very zippy.
Mm.
You know, before you know it, you're sitting in the house of Cephalus having a conversation. Here, good luck like charting this. I usually make my students chart all the ways that we know about this discussion, and it becomes very elaborate, and it's pretty boring and tedious. That's true of Symposium as well. Symposium is worse. Symposium is so convoluted. But why did Plato do that? He didn't have to do it. We already saw that he doesn't always do it.
Mm-hmm.
2, 3, where's the fourth? Timaeus is set up with a conversation about a previous conversation, and then they get right into speeches. They're going to have 3 speeches. We only get 1.5 of those, and I think there's a reason for that. The point of this is Plato knows how to start dialogues in different ways.
Yeah.
Why does he start this one this way? I think because it's so painful. Distancing mechanism. And hopefully you'll get bored enough to quit before you get to the really dangerous parts. Like all these arguments for the existence of the soul, if you look at one way, keep you from getting to the moving, meaningful death of Socrates. So sometimes I think we shouldn't take them that seriously. We endure them, we listen, we go through them so that we can be ready to face the awfulness that comes at the very end. People in philosophy often only care about, the arguments, the 3 or 4 or 5, however you count them, arguments for the existence of the soul, and they leave the prelude and the death of Socrates. Those are just, they don't matter. And I think that's too bad.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's all about reading entire texts. It's that way for a reason.
You guys are so right about that.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. Well, should we do our end notes?
I am at your disposal. I usually have 3-hour classes, so. But see, the thing is, I ask a question and people talk, and so this is more than I should talk.
No, this has
It's
been wonderful.
delightful to listen to you talk this much. Thank you.
Yes.
So, what do we do next? You were telling me you do a cool thing.
So, well, I don't know how cool it is, but we try to introduce listeners to resources that might help them better appreciate the text. We call this endnotes. It can be anything. It can be a movie or a song or another book or something. So what would you give someone? What would you kind of pair this dialogue with?
Wow. So I'll say 2 things. One, I wrote a book that has a chapter introducing this dialogue. So InterVarsity would be mad at me if I didn't say, go by When Athens Met Jerusalem and read the chapter on this. But really go watch The Passion of Joan of Arc. One of my favorite movies. It's hard to say I have a favorite movie, but a movie that I will always watch. But it's a very powerful and intense movie. It's one of the oldest movies made. So it's a silent film. You have to be the kind of person that can watch a silent film. And it's very French. So it's the death of Joan of Arc, but you have to be willing. Basically, her death is so intense that the woman who made this with her luminous eyes, I think never made another film. You can tell when they switch the body out when she's burning alive, and it's way later than you wish that it was. So it's a very intense film. There's a woman who nurses inside of it, if you're the kind of religious person that's offended by that. So those are my 2 disclaimers. But I think it's one of the most beautiful films ever made, and one of the most intense visual reflections on death and life in the Christian tradition ever put on the silver screen, which is literally the silver screen. Okay, so that would be what I would pair it with that I didn't write.
Wow.
I was disappointed because St. John's College here in Annapolis recently did a screening of that, and I wasn't able to attend, but I would have loved to have seen it with the Johnnies.
Yeah, that would have been fun.
Oh yeah. Junius, what about you?
So I'm also gonna go with a movie, but I'm gonna be quite a bit more recent. Anyway, I'm just gonna go with Meet Joe Black. Anthony Hopkins and Brad Pitt, which is a much more thoughtful movie than I think a lot of people give it credit for. But the whole premise here is that death comes to Anthony Hopkins, his character, and it's his time. He's got to go. But before he takes this character away, he wants to spend time observing him, because it seems like this is a guy who has lived life well, and death is trying to understand what does that look like. And so it's both, on the one hand, death trying to understand life, which I think has interesting resonances if life is the primary thing as we get in Phaedo, but also this sense of how does the character that Anthony Hopkins is playing get ready for his death? How does he put his affairs in order in these last few days that he knows that he has? And there's a wonderful moment at the end of the film where death has learned something about what's good about life. And as he and Anthony Hopkins are standing, it's their last conversation together. And the Anthony Hopkins character says to him, "It's hard to let go, isn't it?" And Brad says, "Yeah." And he says, "That's life." And I've heard people misinterpret this as saying, yeah, well, that's just the way life is. It's hard to let go of things. Like, no, you're missing it, right? What he's saying is having things be hard to let go of. That is what living is. That's his message to death. And so I think it's a wonderful reflection in conversation with this Phaedo.
That's amazing.
You get the last word, Father.
Yeah, so mine is a hymn, and so for context, when I first arrived at the parish that I currently am the rector of, the first Sunday that I was just visiting, they sang this, and I knew I was home. This is from the 1940 hymnal, which belonged to the Episcopal Church back in the day. They have a new one now. And it's written by Percy Dermer, who lived in the early 1900s. And the first verse just goes, "Sing praise to God who spoke through man in different times and manners. For those great seers who've led the van, truth writ upon their banners. For those who once blazed out the way, for those who still lead on today, to God be thanks and glory." The second verse is about the Old Testament prophets. But the third verse is for Socrates, who phrase by phrase talked men to truth unshrinking, and left for Plato's mighty grace to mold our ways of thinking. For all who wrestled sane and free to win the unseen reality, to God be thanks and glory. Which I think is a great hymn. Was surprised when I heard it, but I thought it was awesome.
Do you guys do that on All Saints, or I guess All Souls?
No, we don't. We should. That would be a good one.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, no, I love it.
Yeah, I'm always amazed. It isn't normal for the Orthodox, but there is, I am told, I haven't been, an icon in one of the chapels on Mount Athos that contained Plato and Aristotle and some of the other great Greek philosophers, which I prefer as an image to that of Dante, who does place them in hell, though it's kind of fun hell.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. They're still in limbo.
Like hell light.
Mellow hell.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Reynolds, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Fun. This has been a great time.
Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
And listeners, we will see you next month. We'll be discussing the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx with Dr. Kyle Edward Williams will be our guest for that. So we're very excited for that conversation.
Yeah, the Orthodox Church, we're not real fond of Bolshevism, but I can't quite tell you why totally, but go well for us. Let's put it that way.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot in there. It'll be an interesting discussion, but
all right.
It'll still be better than Nietzsche, which we did a couple of weeks ago.
Have fun out there.
Thank you, Dr. Reynolds.